Welcome back to Liberty Bytes on the Think Liberty Network. I'm your host, William Gadsden. You can follow me personally on Twitter at William_Gadsden and follow Think Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever your favorite social media outlet is. Give us a follow and a like for updates on new episodes and more. So this is going to be the first of a 4-episode series on presidents that are traditionally celebrated, but were in fact low-key or not so low-key authoritarians. We're going to roll with 4, but if you like this series, let us know and we can keep going, because let's be honest, we've got plenty of material to work with here. So for this first episode, we're going to talk about Old Hickory, the hero of New Orleans, King Mob. Yes, President Andrew Jackson himself. Now Jackson is a bit of an easy pick for this series. Don't worry, we're going to get to a lot more controversial stuff in later episodes. But for those of you that know a little bit about history, Jackson is often painted as a bit of an anti-hero. He was a man of the people, but he's also responsible for the Trail of Tears. He adopted 2 little Native American boys as his own sons, after massacring most of their tribes. He had a huge wheel of cheese on the White House lawn. We'll get to all of that. It gets weird. But the point is, he has a very checkered history to be sure, but he is still seen as this monumental figure, someone that changed the presidency for the better, despite his flaws. But let's take a look at that history for ourselves and decide if that's the case. Born to Irish immigrants in the Carolinas, which one is still disputed, Andrew Jackson grew up relatively poor, which he would carry as a chip on his shoulder for the rest of his life, and became an orphan before the American Revolution was over. After the war, he found himself adrift, finding work here and there, and eventually settling in as a lawyer in North Carolina. As he built in a law practice and began acquiring wealth in the frontier town of Nashville, he quickly became an up-and-comer in the circles of the wealthy and powerful. He married, got into several duels, and became well known for his short temper and general hot-headed personality. He served as a politician in Tennessee, further gaining political connections. But he eventually devoted himself to the Tennessee State Militia, assembling men to fight aggressive local Native American tribes and venturing further south on military expeditions. And this is also partially where Tennessee gets its nickname of the Volunteer State, and of course the name of UT's sports teams. Now he became most famous for his military ventures during the War of 1812 against the British, specifically in the Battle of New Orleans, where he turned back an invading British force, causing over 2,000 casualties on the enemy side, while only suffering 71 dead, wounded, or missing of his own. He went on to fight campaigns against Native American tribes throughout Florida, decimating several major tribes in the territory. But let's get to the more applicable part of history here, his administration as President of the United States. Now, elected president for his first term in 1828, Jackson immediately started moving to downsize the power of the federal government, in line with his philosophy of reinforcing states' rights. Now, to be clear here, there are a lot of things that Jackson did that are in line with libertarian ideology. He dismantled the national bank, he kept the size of the standing army to a minimum, and he sought the enshrinement of equality of opportunity for the individual, believing that nobody should enjoy special privileges at the cost of someone else's privileges. But what we really want to talk about are his expansions of presidential influence, in many ways circumventing the Constitution itself. For example, Jackson was the first president to draw a direct connection between himself and the American people. Now this sounds like a great thing, and the intentions very well may have been pure, but it didn't take long for unintended consequences to rear their ugly, Hydra-like heads. Now let me explain. Before Jackson, Congress, not the president, was the primary representative body of the people. Each state and each district of each state votes on who is to represent them, who is to be an extension and amplifier of their voice. Because it is broken down to that level, it's far easier for the opinions, wants, and needs of each district and each state to be represented. Each representative can focus on his or her people. The president can't address the wide myriad of issues by himself. It's just not realistic. And yet, Jackson sought to do just that. And in doing so, Jackson made the presidency, to quote historian Major L. Wilson, quote, the true organ of the people's will. This gained for him enormous support from the population, of course, but put him at odds with Congress. Now, a tug of war developed between the executive and legislative branches, with Jackson appealing to the people directly whenever the battle got a bit too heated. Now, if American politics today are any indication, well, Let's just say that in the heat of the moment of politics, voters have never really been that bright. As I've been outlining in the previous episode, that's exactly why the terms and the House-Senate system was set up for Congress. Jackson's direct appeal to the people undermines that entire carefully built system of slow, thoughtful representation. This precedent and radical change of the presidential tradition will continue to haunt us throughout this series, just as it does today. But his expansion of presidential power really came to a head in 1832 under what came to be known as the bank veto. While the details of this particular incident are important historically, I want to home in on the precedent that was set by Jackson early in this fight, the idea that the president must be included in the forming of important legislation in Congress. This alone created a new overlap between the two branches of government, one that was never intended by the Founding Fathers. This too undermined the balance of power, of checks and balances. Perhaps most dangerously of all, Jackson declared that the decisions from the Supreme Court could and should be openly defied by the president, saying that relying only on Supreme Court decisions created a, quote, dangerous source of authority and should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power, except where the acquiescence of the people in the states can be well settled. This quote outlines the lengths that Jackson was willing to go to in order to drive himself as a wedge between the president, the American people, and their representatives in Congress, and the final arbiters of constitutionality, the Supreme Court. In doing so, he massively expanded presidential power and set the stage for further expansion of future presidents, while simultaneously casting aside the power that Congress and the Supreme Court have under the Constitution. His blows with the Supreme Court continued through the rest of his presidency, perhaps most famously resulting in the forced removal of Cherokee tribes from land promised to them by the federal government, in what became known as the Trail of Tears. When the Supreme Court struck down a law Georgia had put in place keeping Native Americans from settling in certain parts of the state, Jackson reportedly said, "Well, John Marshall has made this decision. Now let him enforce it." Such open defiance of another supposedly equal branch of government is another prime example of Jackson setting dangerous authoritarian precedents. His cabinet was also plagued by accusations of nepotism and favoritism, seeming to be more of a constant party than a real branch of government. This is where the giant wheel of cheese comes in, by the way. When said wheel of cheese couldn't be finished in time at a party at the White House, he ended up having it put on the White House lawn for citizens to take a bit of. All in all, Jackson was certainly a man of the people, in the same way that many so-called democratic socialists are considered men or women of the people. Promise them what they want, whisper sweet nothings into their ears, and they'll follow you like the rats followed the Pied Piper. But history has shown us that when we are dazzled by one political hand, the other is usually doing something sinister in the shadows. And that ultimately, even the most well-intentioned actions are judged by their end results, and those results can be devastating. That's it for the Jacksonian chapter of this series. Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll continue to join us when we cover Abraham Lincoln in the next episode, and of course in doing so, become more liberty-centered with us. I'm William Gadsden with Think Liberty.